Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into a very different kind of journey, not through time or space, but through some of the most unforgettable exits in history. The kinds of deaths that make you pause, blink and wonder, did that really happen? From ancient warriors who chose fire over surrender to inventors undone by their own creations, history's most dramatic deaths are often strangely poetic and undeniably tragic. Before we get started, if you enjoy this kind of content, consider liking the video and subscribing, only if you genuinely appreciate what I create here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always find it fascinating to see who's tuning in across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum, and let's ease into tonight's unusual ride through history. We begin with Mithridates VI, king, warrior, polyglot, and possibly the most paranoid monarch in ancient history. Ruler of Pontus in the 1st century BCE, Mithridates lived under constant threat of assassination, which, to be fair, wasn't unreasonable for his time. Poison was the go-to method of ancient political takedown, fast, discreet, and practically fashionable at royal dinners. So what did Mithridates do? He started microdosing poison. Hemlock, arsenic, belladonna, tiny amounts of everything deadly. Over time, he supposedly developed a near-total immunity. His personal apothecaries even concocted the famed Mithridatium, an antidote so powerful that medieval physicians were still chasing its formula over 1,000 years later. Mithridates didn't just eat meals, he challenged them to kill him. But then came Rome. Rome wasn't impressed with his chemical resilience. They wanted Pontus. And after years of conflict, betrayal, and military defeats, Mithridates found himself cornered. Surrounded and unwilling to be paraded through Rome in chains, the proud king reached for his old friend, poison, and nothing happened. After years of self-immunization, Mithridates had become resistant to his own escape plan. Like a chef immune to burns or a fish that couldn't drown, he had over-prepared himself for death. With Roman forces closing in, he turned to a loyal soldier and said, in essence, Plan B, make it quick. And just like that, the king who beat poison fell to the oldest weapon of all, the sword. Mithridates went down in history, not for the wars he fought, but for the immunity he built, only to be undone by steel. It's poetic, really. A reminder that fate always keeps a backup plan, often with a sharp edge. Next up, a Viking tale. And as you'd expect, it includes beheadings, battle bravado, and a rather unexpected dental twist. Meet Sigurd Eysteinsson, better known as Sigurd the Mighty, a Norse earl ruling the Orkney Islands in the 9th century. Bold in battle and not one for restraint, Sigurd had a feud with a Scottish noble named Mael Brigte, the Buck-toothed. Yes, that was his real nickname, and yes, it matters. Tired of the hostilities, Sigurd challenged Brigte to a battle. Each would bring 40 men. Sigurd, being a Viking and not especially honorable in this case, brought 80. Brigte stood no chance. The result was a massacre. Sigurd not only won, he decapitated Brigte and in an ultimate power move, tied the severed head to his saddle as a trophy. That's when things went downhill. As Sigurd rode home, Brigte's head bounced against the horse. One of those famously large teeth scraped Sigurd's leg, just a small cut. But this was the 9th century. No medicine, no antibiotics, barely any soap. The wound got infected. Sigurd fell ill. And within days, he was dead. That's right, he was killed by the tooth of the man he had already killed. Brigte may have lost the fight, but he won the long game. It feels like mythology, a proud warrior brought down not by sword or spear, but by a single, overlooked detail, a literal bite from the past. Viking lore is full of dramatic endings, flaming. Ships, divine curses, but few are as darkly comical as this. Sigurd rode home a victor, but ended up the punchline of his own saga. Lesson here? Even in triumph, check your saddle, and maybe don't tie enemy heads to your horse. Now let's talk about Pyrrhus of Epirus, a brilliant commander who proved that some victories cost more than defeat. He wasn't just any noble. Pyrrhus was Alexander the Great's cousin and one of Rome's fiercest rivals. His military wins were so costly they birthed the term Pyrrhic victory, meaning you technically win, but lose so much doing it that you might as well have lost. After years of campaigns, clashing with Rome and yelling at elephants, Pyrrhus found himself in Argos, embroiled in yet another political mess. He was exhausted, but pride demanded one more battle. So late at night, Pyrrhus led his troops into the city. It wasn't a cinematic entrance. His elephants got stuck in the narrow streets. His soldiers got lost, and by dawn Pyrrhus, great general of the ancient world, was sword-fighting strangers in a back alley. Now comes the twist. Above the chaos, an elderly woman watched from her rooftop. We don't know her name, but we know she had opinions, and a roof tile with pinpoint accuracy, possibly honed by years of throwing things at kids, birds, or invading armies. She dropped the tile. Direct hit. Pyrrhus collapsed. A nearby soldier ran up and finished the job, and that was that. After surviving wars, politics, and war elephants, Pyrrhus was taken out by one woman and her roof. No epic duel, no glorious stand, just bad luck and poor urban planning. There's no statue for the woman, no medal for best use of household items in warfare, but maybe there should be. Pyrrhus became a cautionary tale. No matter how big your army is, gravity still wins. Now we arrive at one of history's most infamous departures, Grigory Rasputin, Russian mystic, supposed healer, and walking controversy. Rasputin was the guy who wouldn't leave the party and somehow had the entire royal household under his spell. Naturally, the Russian aristocracy wanted him gone, politely at first, but Rasputin wasn't great at taking hints, so they escalated to murder. Plan A, poison. They baked him a cake loaded with cyanide. Rasputin ate it, smiled, and asked for seconds. Things got tense. Plan B, shoot him. They did. Right. In the chest. He dropped. Success, not quite. As they leaned in, Rasputin sat up and started shouting like a horror movie villain. So they shot him again, multiple times. He went down, but again, not completely. He reportedly crawled across the floor, trying to escape the palace. Because of course he did. Finally, they tied him up, dragged him to a river and threw him into the icy water, just to be sure. When his body was found downstream, his hands were clawing at the ice, suggesting he was still alive underwater. It took poison, bullets, blunt force, and drowning to finally stop Rasputin. If someone had brought garlic or a wooden stake, no one would have blinked. The takeaway: never underestimate a mystic with iron will and iron skin. Finally, let's talk about Chrysippus of Soli, a Stoic philosopher who taught logic, ethics, and self-control, and who died laughing at his own joke. Stoicism is all about discipline and emotional restraint. But Chrysippus, he went out mid-laugh. One afternoon, while likely pacing around in a toga, he noticed a donkey eating figs. Amused, he told a servant, "Give that donkey some wine to wash it down." And then he laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A full, uncontrollable fit, gasping, wheezing until he collapsed and died. Yes, the man who taught Stoic composure was undone by a donkey joke. To be fair, Greek philosophers weren't strangers to odd deaths. One choked on a fig, another fell into a well while stargazing. But Chrysippus may have had the most committed. Punchline in history. Picture it. Students arriving for a lecture only to find their teacher collapsed, still smiling. It's ironic. Someone who spent their life preaching calmness, undone by joy. Like a fire marshal setting off fireworks indoors. You may forget his theories on logic, but the man who died laughing at a fig-eating donkey, that story lives on. As they say, laughter is the best medicine. Except, maybe in this case. Next up, France's flying tailor. To be continued. Who said birds should have all the fun? Franz Reichelt, an Austrian-born tailor living in early 20th century Paris, wasn't content just making suits. He wanted to make history. His dream? A wearable parachute. Yes, Franz envisioned a coat that could turn into wings, a blend of fashion and flight. At the time, aviation was still unpredictable. Planes resembled flying kites more than machines, and crashes were more frequent than successful landings. Franz believed that if pilots had to go down, they might as well glide down with some style. After countless tests and redesigns, most of which ended with test dummies crashing into the ground, Franz decided it was time for a real demonstration. Against the advice of friends and officials, he insisted on trying it himself. And what better stage than the Eiffel Tower? In 1912, Franz showed up for his moment, dressed in his flying coat, ready for history. Reporters gathered. Cameras were ready. Even the police came, mostly to intervene, but also out of curiosity. He climbed the tower, waved to the crowd, stepped onto the ledge and jumped. The parachute didn't deploy, not even a little. Franz plummeted straight down, crashing to the ground at a speed we could only call terminal. He died instantly. All that remained was a crater, a mangled coat, and stunned silence. Tragic? Absolutely. But also darkly ironic. A man trying to make falling safe, killed by a fall. He died doing what he loved, inventing. Sadly, his final design became his final act. And history, often unkind, didn't remember him as a tailor or inventor, but as the flying tailor, a man who reached for the skies and made it to the ground instead. Think being a Roman emperor was all eternal glory, grapes and golden goblets. Meet Valerian, the only Roman emperor who ended up as furniture. Valerian ruled during the 3rd century CE, when the Roman Empire was falling apart. Plagues, civil wars, invasions. Every year brought new chaos. Still, he tried to hold it together. One of his major threats? The Persians, specifically King Shapur I, who had zero patience for Roman pride. Determined to show strength, Valerian marched east. The Battle of Edessa followed, and it was a disaster. His army was destroyed. Valerian was captured alive, a rare event in ancient warfare. Capturing a Roman emperor was like catching lightning in a bottle, but instead of ransoming him, Shapur chose humiliation. Every time he mounted his horse, he used Valerian as a human footstool, daily and in public. It was calculated degradation. After years of this ritual, Valerian died in captivity. Sources disagree on how. One claims Shapur had him skinned, stuffed with straw, and put on display in a temple, a warning to Rome, and a twisted Persian trophy. Rome, naturally, was not pleased. They refused to admit the truth, pretending Valerian had simply vanished, perhaps enjoying a quiet retirement. But his fate stuck in collective memory. An emperor undone by arrogance, poor planning, and a Persian king with a cruel sense of humor. Now let's talk about King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, a monarch remembered less for policy and more for a fatal dinner. Adolf Frederick ruled in the 18th century, during a peaceful time in Sweden. He wasn't known for military victories or bold reforms. Instead, he's famous for dying at the dinner table, literally. It was Fat Tuesday 1771, the day before Lent, a perfect excuse to overindulge. And Adolf went all in. Historical records say he consumed lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and 14 servings of his favorite dessert, semla. If you've never had semla, picture a spiced bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream, floating in warm milk. Delicious? Yes. Deadly? Only if you eat 14 of them in one sitting. Soon after the feast, the king complained of stomach pains, which is history's polite way of describing what was likely digestive disaster. He died shortly after. Official cause, digestive complications. Modern translation, fatal overeating. Swedes were stunned. One moment he was king. The next he'd been outmatched by dessert. Not war, not politics, just cream and almonds. It was oddly poetic. A monarch consumed by the very excess he enjoyed. Though the royal court tried to preserve dignity, history remembered the menu. Even today, Sweden celebrates Fat Tuesday with semla, and someone always brings up the king, who loved them a bit too much. Now to Diogenes of Sinope, ancient Greece's most unconventional philosopher and full-time provocateur. A leading figure of the Cynic school, Diogenes believed in living simply. Very simply. He wore one tunic, owned almost nothing, and lived in a giant clay jar. His philosophy rejected possessions, social expectations, and shame. And he lived it, loudly and often indecently. So how did this eccentric figure die? Sources vary, always a red flag in ancient history. But one account stands out. Diogenes died by holding his breath, voluntarily, as in, I'm done with the world, I'll just stop breathing. Some see it as willpower, a dramatic final act from a man who preached self-control. Others think he was just stubborn to the end. Alternate stories include eating raw octopus or being bitten by a dog. Fitting, given his fondness for canine metaphors. But the breath-holding tale stuck. Why? Because it feels exactly like Diogenes. This was a man who wandered the city with a lantern, claiming to search for an honest man. A man who told Alexander the Great to move aside, you're blocking my sunlight. So yes, refusing to breathe out of sheer willpower fits. And society, oddly enough, honored him after his death. A man who mocked convention ended up with a public tomb. Turns out, if you spend your life being defiantly weird and clever, people remember you. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, a Roman so rich he made other millionaires look frugal. Crassus owned mines, land, slaves, even fire brigades, which he used for profit. If a building caught fire, his team would offer help if the owner sold him the property first. Think real estate Roman edition, but wealth wasn't enough. Crassus wanted military glory, to be remembered like Caesar or Pompey. So in 53 BCE, he invaded Parthia, Rome's wealthy eastern rival. It went horribly. He underestimated Parthia's deadly archers and expert cavalry. His army was lured deep into the desert and ambushed. His son was killed, morale collapsed, and Crassus was captured. The Parthians knew who he was, Rome's richest man. So for his execution, they poured molten gold down his throat. Yes, he died choking on the very wealth he worshipped. Brutal? Yes, but symbolic. It wasn't just a death, it was a statement. You want gold? Take it, all the way to the lungs. Some say the story is exaggerated or entirely myth. But it spread like wildfire, because in history, poetic endings often outlast the facts. Crassus became a cautionary tale about greed and ego, about reaching too high while clutching too much. Finally, if you've ever heard the phrase, I am Spartacus, no, it isn't just a movie quote. It's the legacy of a man who fought. Until there was no one left to fight with him, Spartacus wasn't born a rebel. He was a Thracian soldier, captured by Rome and thrown into a brutal gladiator school. Less training, more beatings. He survived, adapted, and eventually led a breakout. In 73 BCE, along with 70 others, he escaped using kitchen tools and determination. Within weeks, they'd defeated Roman patrols and built an army of escaped slaves and misfits. It wasn't just a rebellion. It became a movement. For 2 years, Spartacus led them against Rome. They beat trained legions and embarrassed generals. The Senate panicked. Spartacus wasn't just escaping, he was fighting back. Eventually, Rome had enough. They sent Marcus Licinius Crassus, the same Crassus from earlier, molten gold and all, to end it. Spartacus and his men were trapped in southern Italy, outnumbered, surrounded, low on supplies, and with no clear way out. But surrender wasn't in his nature. Instead, Spartacus did what he always did. He fought. According to ancient accounts, He charged straight at Crassus himself, cutting through soldiers like a man with no interest in fading quietly. Though he was reportedly stabbed multiple times, he kept fighting until he disappeared in the chaos of battle. His body was never recovered. No parade, no bound captive paraded through Rome. Just silence. Still, his legend endured. Rome crucified over 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way as a warning, but they couldn't erase the legacy of a man who started with kitchen knives and nearly shattered their empire's pride. Spartacus didn't just die, he refused to fall, and that kind of ending echoes louder than any emperor's coronation. In the disarray of the late Roman Republic, a time when senators plotted over wine and civil wars interrupted lunch breaks, one figure flashes briefly before vanishing in dramatic style: Lucius Junius Brutus Damasippus. Not exactly a household name, Damasippus was a Roman general and staunch supporter of Marius, part of the infamous Marius versus Sulla conflict. Imagine a political debate where everyone had swords and backup legions. When Sulla returned from the east with a battle-hardened army, Rome braced itself. Loyal to the defeated Marian faction, Damasippus was arrested during Sulla's brutal purge, a political cleanup with far more blood than diplomacy. Sentenced to death alongside other prominent figures, Damasippus cemented his place in history, not by action but by reaction. As the condemned were led away, one man began sobbing and pleading. Damasippus turned to him and dryly said, "Why cry, fool? Didn't you know what we came here for?" No begging, no requests, just a dry remark, and a steady walk toward execution. It was the kind of composure that said, "I know how this ends, and I'm fine with it." In a time when final words were often poetic or desperate, Damasippus chose sarcasm. He faced death like an unpleasant appointment. Nothing to lose composure. Over? Was he a great general? Probably not. Did he alter history? No. But he exited with more dignity than many emperors, and sometimes that's enough. If history handed out superlatives, Caligula would win, most likely to be assassinated. By lunchtime, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he seemed destined for greatness. The Roman public adored him. The army worshipped him. As the son of a war hero and raised in the imperial court, he looked like Rome's golden child in 37 CE. But soon, things unraveled dramatically. His reign descended into a bizarre mix of paranoia and theatrical rule. Caligula declared himself a living god, demanded worship, and infamously named his horse Incitatus, a senator. The horse never showed up, but did enjoy a marble stable, jeweled collar, and reportedly better manners than many senators. Caligula executed officials for minor offenses, waged symbolic war against the sea god Poseidon, and once commanded his troops to gather seashells as victory spoils. This wasn't just instability, it was eccentricity on a creative scale. Eventually, even his own guards tired of the chaos. In 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard, his own protectors, cornered him in a palace corridor. No speeches, no drama, just over 30 stab wounds. That's not an assassination, it's a group intervention with daggers. His body was tossed into a shallow grave, denied honors or ceremony. Yet Caligula is remembered not for wise policies, but for ruling like a fever dream and dying just as chaotically. Betrayed, isolated, and likely thinking, "My horse could have done better." He might have been right. Few deaths in history are as oddly theatrical, or wine-themed, as that of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. If the name sounds familiar, it's because he was caught in the middle of England's most infamous family feud, the Wars of the Roses. Think Game of Thrones, but with more velvet and less CGI. George was King Edward IV's younger brother and Richard III's older brother. For a while, he was next in line for the crown. Unfortunately, George had two major flaws: unchecked ambition and no sense of caution. He flip-flopped loyalties during the war, schemed relentlessly, and made enemies like it was a sport. Eventually, King Edward had enough and arrested him for treason. But how do you execute your own brother without causing a scandal? Enter one of history's strangest solutions. Chroniclers claim George was given a choice in how to die, and he selected drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Not the gallows, not the axe, not even a discreet poison. A full barrel of wine, as if he wanted his legacy to read, "Died the way he lived," lavishly. Whether this really happened or was later embellished, it fits George's flair for drama. Messy, absurd, and oddly poetic. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, likely without the wine, and faded into history, except for the unforgettable way he checked out. So next time family drama gets intense, just remember, at least no one's been executed by Merlot barrel. That's a vintage ending. To conclude our look at history's most memorable exits, we reach a story that proves genius offers no protection against bad timing. The death of Archimedes. Possibly the greatest intellect of ancient Greece, Archimedes was a mathematician, engineer, and inventor who could look at a puddle and discover fluid dynamics. He invented levers, pulleys, and war machines, and was rumored to have defended Syracuse using mirrors to focus sunlight onto Roman ships. True or not, his brilliance is undisputed. Unfortunately, what he lacked was social awareness. In 212 BCE, as Roman forces finally stormed Syracuse after a prolonged siege, they ransacked the city. Amid the chaos, Archimedes was found hunched over a sand diagram, deep in thought. A Roman soldier approached. Most people would have stood up and pleaded for their life, not Archimedes. According to legend, he simply looked up and said, "Do not disturb my circles." No introduction, no fear, just a stern warning to respect his geometry. The soldier, confused, annoyed, or simply uninterested in math, killed him on the spot. A genius silenced mid-equation. General Marcellus, who had explicitly ordered Archimedes be spared, was furious, but by then it was too late. The man who had calculated water displacement and invented the screw pump was undone by a soldier who likely didn't know what a hypotenuse was. There's a tragic irony in that. Archimedes, destroyed not by rivalry, but by ignorance. Let it be a reminder, even when you're chasing big ideas, look up occasionally, especially during an invasion. Being royalty came with perks, luxurious robes, endless feasts, personal choirs. But as King Henry I of France learned, it didn't come with back support. Henry wasn't a wild king. He didn't ride into battle, shirtless, or throw debauched feasts. In medieval terms, he was a remarkably stable ruler. From 1031 to 1060, he handled rebellions, raised children, and built churches. Nothing too flashy, yet what people remember isn't his reign, but how it ended. One day, after a long period sitting, perhaps in prayer or at a dull meeting, Henry stood up too quickly and collapsed. Possibly a stroke, maybe an aneurysm, or just gravity making its point. He died shortly after. Medical knowledge in the 11th century was limited at best. A local doctor probably waved herbs, mentioned bad humors, and recommended bloodletting. Unsurprisingly, it didn't help. And just like that, the King of France became one of the earliest documented victims of what we now call orthostatic hypotension, that sudden dizzy spell when standing up too fast. In Henry's case, it rolled the end credits. It may seem anticlimactic for a monarch to die after standing, but consider the symbolism. Sometimes, even a throne can't stop you from tipping over. A ruler who survived wars, conspiracies, and plague, brought down not by a sword, but by a sudden shift in posture. It's as if history murmured, even kings fall to leg cramps. In medieval Japan, where honor was often tied to swordplay and dramatic farewells, Sesshu Toyo took a quieter path, one shaped by ink, silence, and remarkable focus. Born in 1420, Sesshu was raised in a temple and trained as a Zen monk. Like most monks, he was expected to live a life of meditation, modesty, and cleaning floors. But Sesshu had a dilemma. He loved to draw, constantly, especially when he wasn't allowed to. One well-known story says that as a child, when tied up as punishment for avoiding chores, he drew a mouse with his toe, so lifelike that it startled the monks. Yes, his punishment doodles were jump scares. Sesshu later traveled to China to master ink painting at its source. When he returned, his work was bold, fluid, and emotionally rich, transforming Japanese art. He painted landscapes that seemed to breathe, mountains floating in mist, trees with more presence than dinner guests. He aged with his brush in hand, capturing nature and stillness, core Zen themes. While samurai of his time often met dramatic ends, Sesshu simply kept painting, and when death came in 1506, he faced it just as he had faced life, with a brush. Legend says his final act was to request ink and paper, then make one last confident stroke. No name, no message, just a single mark on a blank sheet. He didn't die in combat or by poison beneath cherry blossoms. He painted until the end, letting ink speak where words could not. A quiet death, but a profound one if you understand what it means to leave behind a masterpiece in silence. So when life feels overwhelming, remember Sesshu. Sometimes the final word is just a line. If your idea of a samurai death involves cherry, blossoms and slow-motion honor, you're probably thinking of Saigo Takamori. Born in 1828, Saigo climbed the ranks as a skilled warrior and states, "The final battle took place at Shiroyama. Surrounded and injured, Saigo saw his forces falling apart. What happened next is debated. Some say he committed ritual suicide, seppuku. Others say a loyal soldier helped him die quickly due to his wounds. Either way, he died with his sword by his side, facing a future he had helped create but could no longer belong to. Japan mourned him, then immortalized him. The same government that crushed his rebellion later pardoned him, built statues, and praised his nobility, as if cannons had never been fired at him. Saigo became a tragic icon, a man who fought for values the world had outgrown. Sometimes you don't need to win to be remembered. You just need to lose with dignity. Jesse James wasn't just an outlaw, he was America's symbol of rebellion, with a gun in one hand and a train schedule in the other. Born in 1847 in Missouri, Jesse began as a Confederate guerrilla, attacking Union troops and torching anything in his path. After the war, he didn't stop. He upgraded from rebel to legendary criminal, leading the James Younger Gang in a decade-long spree of robberies across the Midwest. To newspapers, he was a folk hero. To banks, a menace. To law enforcement, a wanted man with a reward so high it made his friends nervous. Which brings us to Robert Ford, Jesse's so-called friend and gang member, recently promised a pardon and $10,000 for delivering Jesse, dead or alive. In April 1882, Jesse was hiding in St. Joseph, Missouri, living under a fake name. The Ford brothers were staying with him, like roommates, but with more weapons. On April 3rd, Jesse removed his guns and climbed a chair to dust a picture on the wall. A quiet, domestic moment. Ford pulled out his revolver and shot him in the head, mid-sentence, mid-reach, mid-dusting. The legend of the Wild West fell from a chair with chores unfinished, a death both iconic and oddly mundane. Ford expected praise. Instead, he was hated. The public didn't admire Jesse because he was good. They admired his audacity. And killing him like that? It wasn't brave. It was opportunistic. Jesse didn't go down in a shootout. He died in his socks, betrayed by a man drinking his coffee. Sometimes history isn't a dramatic standoff. Sometimes it's a quiet betrayal. If you've never heard of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, know this. He wore a top hat, helped build Victorian Britain, and had a name that sounded like a train. Born in 1806, Brunel was a brilliant engineer. He sketched bridges at breakfast and reimagined the limits of construction. He built tunnels beneath rivers, suspension bridges across valleys, and trains faster than what seemed safe. But ships were his greatest dream, massive steamships. In the mid-19th century, he designed the SS Great Eastern, so large it made other ships look like toys. Over 700 feet long, powered by paddle wheels and a screw propeller, it could sail to Australia without refueling, but from day one, it was plagued with problems. Workers died, fires broke out, the launch failed twice. A man was even trapped inside the hull for days. It was so heavy, it had to be launched sideways. Impressive, but dangerous. Already stressed and chain-smoking, Brunel suffered a stroke. On board, during a demonstration, some say the stress killed him. Others say it was the sheer pressure of expectations. He died just days before the ship's first voyage in 1859. That voyage, the ship exploded. A steam pipe burst, killing 6. Though it survived, the dream had cracked. Brunel's death wasn't flashy, but it was symbolic. He was undone by his own vision, pushing limits and forgetting that reality has its own rules. Most are buried quietly. Brunel left behind a steel giant that nearly crushed his name, yet his bridges still stand, tunnels still work, and the top hat, still iconic. Sometimes the grandest ends come from dreaming too far past the edge. Cleopatra. Selene Sekou was born into a world ruled by myth, ambition, and power games. Her mother, Cleopatra VII, called herself the goddess Isis reborn. Her father, Mark Antony, was Rome's legendary general, torn between duty and love. Born in 40 BCE, Selene wasn't just a child. She was a political symbol, proof that Rome and Egypt might rule together, not as enemies, but allies. She was born in Alexandria, a city of marble columns and towering obelisks, where priests prayed in ancient languages and scholars debated. Under the stars, the great library still stood. The cult of Isis thrived. Selene and her twin brother, Alexander Helios, were schooled in Greek thought, Egyptian spirituality, and Roman politics. She learned to balance worlds few could even see. But her life was also a trap. Cleopatra and Antony had handed out kingdoms, like wedding favors, crowning their children with titles but no armies. Selene was made queen of Cyrenaica and Libya before she could walk. Her name meant moon, a twin to her brother's sun. But this moon would soon have to learn how to survive in darkness. Back in Rome, Octavian, later Augustus, watched with suspicion. Antony's bond with Cleopatra wasn't just scandalous. It was treason. When war broke out, Selene's fate was sealed by choices far beyond her control. At just 10 years old, she saw everything collapse. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE ended in total defeat. Her father died by suicide. Her mother followed, famously by a snakebite. Suddenly, the girl, once wrapped in gold, became a prisoner, an orphan held by the very man who destroyed her family. She didn't cry. She didn't crumble. History doesn't record her words, but her actions spoke. While many royal children faded, Selene did something rare. She endured, and that was just the beginning. After the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra Selene, barely 10 years old, was taken across the Mediterranean as a symbol of conquest. She didn't arrive in Rome as a princess, but as a living trophy of Octavian's victory. Alongside her brothers, she was displayed in a grim public procession. The children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, now orphaned, bound in gold chains, walking behind the man who had dismantled their dynasty. Imagine that, the daughter of divine Rulers paraded like plunder. The same Roman streets that once celebrated Julius Caesar now bore witness to her degradation. Yet, Selene didn't cry. No historical records describe tears or resistance. Instead of the weeping child the crowd may have anticipated, they saw a girl carrying herself with unsettling composure. Some sources even suggest the crowd pitied her, and in Rome, pity could wield more power than fear. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, understood the optics. Executing Antony and Cleopatra's children would tarnish his image as a merciful and civilized ruler. So, he made a calculated decision. He entrusted them to his sister, Octavia, who, in a bitter twist, was also Antony's former wife. Surprisingly, this turned out to be a hidden blessing. In Octavia's care, Selene received protection, a Roman education, and something far more valuable, a second chance. Octavia wasn't just a political figure, she was respected for her poise and moderation. Under her roof, Selene was raised with Roman discipline, Greek scholarship, and a subtle but ever-present nod to her Egyptian heritage. In Rome's heart, the young would-be queen watched and learned. She absorbed the politics of survival, mastered the art of timing her words, and discovered when silence could speak louder than protest. She studied Latin, rhetoric, and Roman mythology, even the stories of those who had brought down her ancestors. She noticed how Roman women wielded influence, without crowns, but through strategic marriages, alliances, and intellect. As her brothers faded into historical obscurity, Selene adapted. She didn't resist Rome with weapons. She understood it and made herself essential to its framework. Outwardly, she appeared to be a Romanized ward, but inwardly she was calculating her return to power, not through defiance, but through something more enduring, alliance. Cleopatra Selena's path from captive to queen was forged not through defiance, but through intelligence and planning. As she grew into her teenage years, Rome continued reshaping the world to its design, appointing client kings like pieces on a vast imperial chessboard. Augustus, ever the strategist, viewed Selene as both a risk and an asset. He made his move, arranging her marriage. Her husband would be King Juba II of Mauritania, a scholarly and Romanized monarch, himself once a child captive raised in Rome. Son of a North African ally of Julius Caesar, Juba had lost his father to the tides of Roman politics, just like Selene. He too had been paraded as a conquered prince and raised under Octavia's guardianship. Educated, loyal, and politically reliable, Juba was the ideal candidate, a safe extension of Roman rule. In the distant territory, their marriage was not simply personal, it was a diplomatic triumph. Two children of fallen dynasties, brought to Rome as tokens of victory, now returned to rule a kingdom neither had asked for. And yet, it worked. Selene became Queen of Mauritania, modern-day Algeria, and Morocco, a land rich in culture, but politically fractured. She didn't act as a figurehead, but as a ruler with ambition. Together, she and Juba transformed their capital city, renaming it Caesarea in honor of Augustus. But this renaming wasn't cosmetic. Under Selene's influence, the city flourished, a fusion of Egyptian elegance, Greek artistry, and Roman infrastructure. Temples rose, libraries opened, and coins were minted bearing her likeness adorned with the sun crown of Egyptian royalty, a subtle yet powerful signal of her lineage. Selene didn't merely act like a queen. She reshaped an entire region. While Juba devoted himself to diplomacy and writing, imagining himself a historian and geographer, Selene brought governance. She handled commerce, sponsored the arts, and crafted a hybrid national identity that reflected her unique background. Far from Rome's gaze and Alexandria's ruins, Cleopatra Selene didn't just endure, she thrived. Her life, once shattered by politics and violence, became an exceptional story of quiet reclamation. She was no longer an emblem of defeat. She was a sovereign in her own right. But Selene never settled for being a ceremonial figure or a silent partner. She had been born into empire, shaped by tragedy and tempered by humiliation. Now, with a throne beneath her and a kingdom in her hands, she created something Rome had never quite expected. A ruler who blended three civilizations into one purposeful vision. Mauritania had always been a crossroads, inhabited by Berber tribes, Phoenician merchants, and the remnants of Carthaginian influence. Under Selene, this patchwork became intentional. She didn't impose Egyptian authority, nor did she fully conform to Roman tastes. Instead, she fused the elements intelligently. She led the construction of harbors, temples, and markets. Roman aqueducts wove through cities adorned with Egyptian symbols. Statues of Isis stood near Roman forums. Greek theaters thrived beside North African craftsmanship. The result wasn't disorder, it was balance. A kingdom that was both ancient and forward-looking, loyal to Rome yet undeniably distinct. Selene stayed in the public eye, a rarity for queens of client kingdoms. Her face appeared on coins, not behind Jubas, but beside his, wearing the iconography of ancient Egyptian queens. The solar disk, the vulture crown, symbols of divine sovereignty. Quietly, she reminded the world, Egypt's bloodline still lived through her. More than anything, Selene saw diplomacy as an art form. She understood how to engage Rome's power without being consumed by it. She hosted ambassadors, oversaw trade, and was likely involved in shaping tax policy, especially in leveraging Mediterranean commerce. Under her leadership, Mauritania wasn't just compliant, it was effective, prosperous, and indispensable, even as Roman elites gossiped about her heritage and her mother's scandalous legacy. Selene gave them no cause for scandal. No rumors, no rebellions, only growth, stability, and silent authority. Yet the memory of Alexandria remained with her, the fall of her lineage, the cobra's bite, her father's final stand. But Selene didn't seek to revive Egypt. She reimagined it, rebuilding its spirit on Berber soil, far from the ashes of its past. And in doing so, she founded a new legacy. Not a restored Egypt, but a renewed dynasty. Cleopatra Selene lived between worlds, Egyptian by birth, Roman by education, and now North African by crown. Rather than choosing a single identity, she embraced all three. She was daughter of Isis, and Roman matron, Hellenistic thinker and tribal queen. This complexity wasn't just clever strategy, it was necessary. Selene had learned from her mother's fate. Rome celebrated obedient queens, not bold ones. So she stayed composed, regal, and always calculating. She avoided scandal, but cultivated influence. Symbolism became one of her greatest tools. Her coinage wasn't merely decorative, it was political messaging. She combined Egyptian regalia with Roman styles, solar crowns, laurel wreaths, Latin, inscriptions. These coins traveled across Africa and the Mediterranean, silently asserting Cleopatra's lineage still held power. Selene also promoted religious integration. The cult of Isis thrived under her rule, as did worship of Roman gods and local African deities. This wasn't simple tolerance, it was political unification. She mirrored what Augustus had done in Rome, unite diverse people through shared spiritual symbols. Despite her composed public image, Selene was never a passive consort. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests she held considerable authority, governing, in Juba's absence, issuing decrees, directing grain shipments and mediating tribal conflicts. She was more than queen, she was co-sovereign, and remarkably she achieved this without violence. Cleopatra Selene's rule was defined by stability, a rarity in antiquity, especially for a woman of her background. She didn't conquer with force, she inspired with strategy. Once displayed in chains, she became a monarch, respected by senators and merchants alike, not through fear but intelligence. As Queen of Mauritania, Celine's true legacy began to take shape, not in bronze or marble, but in the life of her son. Ptolemy of Mauritania was born into this carefully curated dynasty, a final thread of a noble lineage stretching from Alexander's generals to Egyptian gods. Celine didn't raise him simply as a royal heir, but as a living synthesis of empire. He received the best education: Latin law, Greek philosophy, Egyptian theology. But above all, he learned diplomacy, taught by a queen who had mastered survival in a hostile world. Celine likely saw herself in him. Like her, he was born into a high-stakes political arena, and like her, he would have to walk the line between legacy and survival. Unlike her mother, Selene had the advantage of raising Tommy in a stable environment, a kingdom she had already shaped into a haven of order. But she wasn't idealistic. She had witnessed how easily dynasties collapse when their successors grow careless or complacent. So she trained Tommy not in warfare, but in diplomacy, governance, and cultural literacy. He was raised to speak the languages of power, both literally and figuratively. What's most striking is that Selene never attempted to rebuild Egypt through her son. She understood the reality. The world had moved on. Augustus ruled with absolute authority, and any effort to revive old claims would be crushed. Instead, she subtly wove Egypt into the fabric of Mauritania through temples, traditions, and imagery, and quietly passed that legacy to Tommy. For a time, her strategy worked. Tommy succeeded his father and ruled as king in his own right. Rome respected him, even granting him honorary consulship. He was treated like Roman royalty because he was. Through Tommy, Selene had achieved what her parents never could, securing their lineage peacefully. Her son wasn't a relic of failure, but a symbol of transformation, and through him, her quiet empire endured a little longer. History often elevates the loud, the conquerors, rebels, and infamous rulers. But Cleopatra Selene left behind no famous speeches, no treatises. Her legacy whispered through coins, cityscapes, government policies, and the survival of a dynasty many thought finished. In her later years, she vanishes from Roman records. Some historians suspect this was erasure, others think it was intentional. Public life in Rome carried risks, especially for a woman of her ancestry. Perhaps she chose to lead from behind. The curtain. Effective, discreet, untouched by scandal, and that's notable. No records of scandal, no betrayals, no passionate executions. In a world shaped by male pride, shifting alliances, and ethnic bias, Selene left her rivals no foothold. She grasped that power wasn't for show. It was meant to be exercised with precision. That restraint may have been her most powerful legacy. Unlike her mother, she didn't attempt to reclaim Egypt or oppose Rome. Instead, she gave sanctuary to those who had followed her from Alexandria, to those who still honored the old gods. Archaeological evidence shows that under her rule, Mauritania became a spiritual mosaic. Egyptian imagery was found next to Roman mosaics, and shrines to Isis stood alongside altars to Jupiter. This harmony of beliefs was held together by her subtle influence. Even the capital city, Caesarea, bore her mark. Though named for Augustus, its character reflected her vision. Public works thrived, architecture maintained Hellenistic grace, and native arts gained royal support. She wasn't trying to revive Alexandria, she was moving beyond it. Still, memories lingered, her mother's glorification and vilification, her father's disgrace, the fall of a city, the end of a dynasty, and the near erasure of a royal bloodline. Selene never spoke of these things. History preserves no record of her voice, but she didn't need to speak. Her actions, her policies, the temples she built, the symbols she embraced, formed a wordless memoir. Time forgot her voice, but remembered what she left behind, and then she was gone. Cleopatra Selene, queen and daughter of legends, disappeared from history. There was no grand obituary, no marked tomb, no Roman chronicler recorded her final moments. For someone born amid great historical upheaval, her end was quiet, like a candle burning out. Scholars estimate her death around 5 BCE, based on the sudden disappearance of her name from official records and coinage. One day she ruled beside her husband Juba. The next, only his image appeared on the coins. No ceremony, no public mourning, only silence. But silence says much. In royal circles, such an exit could mean a peaceful passing or an intentional removal. Given how carefully she navigated Roman politics, either scenario is plausible. Yet, no hint of scandal followed. Juba continued to rule, but Mauritania never quite regained its former brilliance. He remarried, this time to Glaphyra, a Cappadocian princess, but that union had little lasting impact. Though Juba was a dutiful ruler and an author, the realm dimmed. Selene had been more than a queen, she had been its spirit. Their son Tommy inherited the crown after them, but his fate too would be tragic. He was executed in Rome by Emperor Caligula decades later for reasons still debated. With him, the bloodline of Cleopatra Selene truly ended, yet her presence lingered. Coins bearing her image remained in circulation. The Egyptian cults she supported thrived for centuries across North Africa. Cities like Caesarea became key centers of trade and culture under Rome. Her influence endured, not with fanfare, but through the steady evolution of a society she helped shape. She left no grand tomb, but she built a kingdom. No preserved speeches, but policies that impacted lives. No armies, but she brought order to chaos inherited from her parents. Cleopatra Selene disappeared from historical record, not because she failed, but because she succeeded in embedding herself within the very fabric of empire. Her final brilliance may have been in choosing to vanish not as a victim of history, but as one of its architects. Though Cleopatra Selene II died in silence, her story didn't end. Her son, Tommy of Mauritania, carried her legacy forward, a prince who embodied generations of ambition, myth, and endurance. He was the last recorded descendant of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a living echo of Alexander's generals and Egyptian pharaohs. Raised in the refined world his mother built, Tommy inherited not just a kingdom, but a delicate political heritage. He was youthful, wealthy, Romanized, and fluent in diplomacy and multiple languages. While his reign wasn't as transformative as his mother's, it was marked by stability and loyalty to Rome. But he walked a dangerous line. A client king with a pedigree too prestigious to ignore. Initially, he thrived. Augustus made him a senator, and later emperors welcomed him at court. His wealth, generosity, and elegance won praise. He wore purple and dined with emperors, an image of cultivated royalty. But with Roman favor came Roman jealousy. Tommy had what many feared, ancient legitimacy, and under unstable rulers, such legacy invited suspicion. His fall came under Caligula, the erratic emperor. In 40 CE, Tommy visited Rome dressed in regal finery. According to sources, Caligula remarked, "There is only room for one king in Rome." Soon after, Tommy was executed. No trial, no rebellion, just swift elimination. With his death, the dynasty of Cleopatra, Alexander, and the goddess Isis was extinguished, not through war, but through imperial paranoia. Still, their influence remained. Rome annexed Mauritania, but it adopted many of the systems Selene had, implemented her cities, temples, and blended traditions. Even in death, she shaped the region. Rome tried to erase her legacy, but never fully succeeded. The Tommies became legend. Cleopatra Selene, once paraded through Rome as a war prize, ultimately outlived her enemies through legacy, culture, and her son's brief, brilliant life. The last Tommy died, but the world he inherited still bore her symbols, her vision, and her quiet strength. Before books or scrolls, there was clay, solid, enduring, and oddly timeless. At the top of one such clay stack was the first known library in human history, built by a king who valued knowledge more than conquest. Welcome to Nineveh, around 650 BCE. The ruler, Ashurbanipal, king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and self-declared king of the world. Unlike other monarchs, Ashurbanipal wasn't content with temples or military trophies. He envisioned something deeper, a vault of human understanding. At the heart of his palace, he ordered the creation of a vast repository of texts. The library of Ashurbanipal wasn't just storage. It was a systematic effort to gather, organize, and protect Mesopotamian knowledge. And by gather, we mean seize, duplicate, and catalogue. Royal agents scoured the empire, demanding documents from scribes, priests, and scholars. By the time the project neared completion, the collection had grown to over 30,000 clay tablets. They covered topics like medicine, astrology, rituals, legal, codes, dictionaries, love poetry, even exorcism spells. Among them was the oldest known version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed on baked clay. Each tablet was labeled, categorized, and stored by genre. Ashurbanipal's library even had an early reference system, labels noting where each piece belonged, a primitive catalog system long before the invention of library cards. Remarkably, Ashurbanipal claimed he could read them. Unlike most rulers, he boasted literacy in Sumerian and Akkadian, languages already ancient in his era. His inscriptions declare, "I have read the cunningly written tablets of Sumer and the difficult Akkadian language." But the collection wouldn't last forever. When Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE, the palace burned. Ironically, the fire preserved much of the library. The flames hardened the clay, locking the texts in time. Millennia later, archaeologists uncovered the scorched remnants, clues to a forgotten intellectual empire, and in that silence they uncovered a king's dream, an ancient clay time capsule that clung to memory, refusing to vanish. While the Assyrians imprinted their legacy into clay, the Egyptians turned to something more refined, papyrus. With it, they created some of history's first literary sanctuaries, the House of Life, a unique blend of temple, archive, and scriptorium. These weren't public libraries as we know them today. They were sacred institutions, where priests, scribes, and scholars preserved the foundational knowledge of their civilization. Situated in key temple complexes like Abydos, Thebes, and Edfu, each House of Life was considered a living entity, deeply connected to the divine, especially Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, and magic. Inside, scribes carefully hand-copied texts, myths, hymns, spells, astronomical charts, medical handbooks, legal codes, and administrative logs. Each scroll wasn't merely informational, it was believed to carry divine essence. The work was laborious, repetitive, and spiritually significant. Scribes began training young, mastering hieroglyphs and the hieratic script. An error wasn't just a mistake, it was a spiritual lapse. And because papyrus was fragile and valuable, it was stored in arid, controlled environments, usually in wooden chests or ceramic jars, labeled with tags and string. Each House of Life used its own method of organizing texts, though the details haven't fully survived. The most renowned was likely at Per Ankh in Thebes, which preserved royal medical documents for generations. It's thought that the Ebers Papyrus, a medical compendium of treatments, incantations, and surgical instructions, was created and handed down there. But access to these libraries was highly restricted. They weren't centers of public learning, but elite enclaves for temple priests and royal advisors. In Egypt, knowledge equaled power, and power was tightly guarded. What one knew could determine their status, their religious function, or even their afterlife, especially when it included spells from the Book of the Dead. Still, these libraries connected generations of scribes, maintaining Egypt's cultural memory through invasions, famines, and dynastic upheavals. When foreign powers came, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the houses of life declined. Their scrolls disappeared, burned or decayed, but fragments survived, buried with mummies or traded. Across borders, scribbled in ink on brittle papyrus, Egypt's wisdom wasn't erased. It slipped into history's shadows, waiting to be rediscovered. Even before modern catalogues, Babylon had built its own information network, an empire shaped by clay, stars, and sacred order. While Ashurbanipal's library is the most famous, Babylon's scholarly centers extended through temples, ziggurats, and royal precincts. These weren't mere collections of texts. They were cosmic blueprints, recording divine cycles, royal decrees, and CE. Babylon also excelled in mathematics. Their libraries included texts that reveal knowledge of advanced geometry and early algebra. The Plimpton 322 tablet, for example, contains trigonometric data that predates Greek innovations by over a millennium. To modern eyes, it resembles a draft version of a calculus primer. Babylonian scribes used colophons, short notes at the end of tablets, to identify authorship, origins, and sometimes to warn against theft or misuse. These weren't just archival texts. They were early claims of intellectual ownership, but as Babylon changed hands, from Hittites to Persians to Greeks, its libraries declined. Many tablets were looted or broken, their pieces buried beneath. Centuries of ruin. The arid climate preserved some, but most were lost until 19th century excavations unearthed thousands of fragments. Even shards the size of a hand revealed laws, recipes, spells, and celestial charts. They showed that long before Aristotle or Euclid, the people of Mesopotamia had created a knowledge system that was both pragmatic and poetic. The shelves may have crumbled, but Babylon's clay voices still speak. If there was a capital of ancient knowledge, it was Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great and governed by the Ptolemies, this Egyptian-Greek metropolis became a beacon of scholarship. At its core stood the Great Library of Alexandria, constructed in the 3rd century BCE within the Museion, a temple complex dedicated to the Muses. The library was more than a structure. It was a mission to gather every scroll, book, and fragment of global knowledge. This wasn't a quiet corner for scholars. It was an intellectual empire. Under rulers like Ptolemy I and II, agents scoured the Mediterranean, collecting or copying scrolls from every major port. Ships arriving in Alexandria were searched, and any texts found on board were copied and catalogued. The library's collection spanned cultures and disciplines: Hebrew scriptures, Indian science, Babylonian astronomy, all translated into Greek. Some estimates suggest it housed between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Topics ranged from philosophy and engineering to medicine, poetry, botany, and history. Homer's epics were refined here. Archimedes' ideas passed through its halls. Eratosthenes, one of its librarians, famously calculated Earth's circumference with impressive precision. But this library wasn't just about amassing texts. It was about refining them. Scholars cross-referenced manuscripts, identified inconsistencies, and produced the earliest known critical editions. They preserved the best versions and interrogated the rest. Yet Alexandria's greatness made it vulnerable. Fires, conflicts, and shifting ideologies steadily eroded its collection. One major loss likely occurred in 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar's troops, trapped in Alexandria's harbour, set fire to enemy ships, accidentally damaging parts of the library. As the Roman Empire took root, Alexandria became a battleground for competing beliefs, pagan, Christian, Gnostic, and the library suffered further. By the time of the Muslim conquest in 642 CE, its condition was uncertain. Some accounts claim Caliph Umar ordered its destruction, arguing that any books not aligned with the Quran were unnecessary or heretical. However, scholars still debate whether the library had already vanished by then. What is clear is this: the great library no longer exists. Not a single scroll remains, and yet its story lives on, a testament to humanity's dream of universal knowledge. Alexandria endures as a symbol, not of what was built, but of what was lost. While Alexandria dazzled the world, another city quietly emerged as a scholarly powerhouse, Pergamon, in what is now Turkey. During the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, under the Attalid dynasty, Pergamon rose to cultural prominence. At its center stood the Library of Pergamon, founded by King Eumenes II, and said to contain over 200,000 scrolls, second only to Alexandria. But this library wasn't focused on quantity alone. Pergamon emphasized quality, meticulous organization, and an intellectual environment that fostered medical innovation, philosophical debate, and historical documentation. It also had a critical edge: parchment. According to legend, when the Ptolemies learned of Pergamon's growing influence, they restricted papyrus exports to undermine it. In response, Pergamon perfected the use of animal skin, pergamenum or parchment. While not entirely new, their refinements made it smoother, more durable, and moisture-resistant. This was a turning point. Scrolls became sturdier, more enduring, and eventually easier to transport. It laid the groundwork for the Codex, the early form of the modern book. Pergamon's library was a vibrant academic hub. It attracted Stoic and peripatetic philosophers and advanced medical studies. Galen, one of the ancient world's most influential physicians, was born in Pergamon and may have studied there. The rivalry between Pergamon and Alexandria ignited an intellectual arms race. Cities competed not through warfare but through wisdom. Scholars were enticed with patronage, stipends, and status. It was, briefly, a golden age of learning. In a twist of history, Pergamon's scrolls eventually ended up in Alexandria. When Mark Antony married Cleopatra, he supposedly gifted the Pergamon library to her as a romantic offering. Whether fact or legend, it illustrates how closely libraries were tied to politics, empire, and love. Although Pergamon's library has vanished, its influence persists. Parchment outlived empires. Its innovation transformed how knowledge was stored and shared, its legacy quite literally written into history. While scrolls were traded across the Mediterranean, ancient China was building its own literary infrastructure, rooted not in myth, but in governance, tradition, and deep respect. For writing, during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, libraries weren't just cultural centers. They were vital tools of statecraft, identity, and authority. Han emperors recognized a critical truth: whoever controls the records controls the narrative. So, they launched a systematic effort to collect, duplicate, and standardize key texts. This wasn't only about preserving classics, it was about shaping society. Confucianism had become the state ideology, and its foundational writings, like the Analects and Book of Rites, were compiled, copied, and elevated as national doctrine. Books and records were carefully collected and preserved in imperial archives, chief among them the library at Chang'an, capital of the Han Dynasty. Unlike the famous Library of Alexandria, this institution wasn't open to roaming scholars. It was a formal state archive maintained by court historians, scholars, and scribes. Inside, one could find not only literary texts, but census data, astronomical charts, maps, legal codes, and genealogies. Each mark on bamboo or silk carried the authority of the state. One of the most influential figures to emerge from this system was Liu Xiang, a Han Dynasty scholar. He didn't simply catalogue the collection, he edited and annotated the texts, often determining which versions would endure. His son, Liu Xin, carried on the task and helped develop one of the earliest classification systems, grouping texts into 6 core categories: classics, philosophy, poetry, warfare, medicine, and divination. Their work wasn't without risk. During the earlier Qin dynasty, thousands of texts had been lost in state-sponsored book burnings and intellectual purges. The Han, aware of what was at stake, viewed their libraries as a cultural restoration. Yet the materials were fragile. Texts, on bamboo strips tied with string, were vulnerable to fire and decay, while silk scrolls, though elegant, were delicate and expensive. Still, the Han dynasty succeeded in preserving a large portion of China's intellectual heritage. Their archives may not have been mythologized like Alexandria, but they arguably safeguarded even more. In China, the written word didn't just challenge the sword, it recorded it. As Buddhism spread through Asia, it brought with it another innovation: the library. Temples became more than places of worship. They became repositories of thought and guardians of fragile wisdom. From India to China, from Tibet to Japan, Buddhist institutions treated books not just as tools, but as sacred objects. The tradition began in India, where early Buddhist teachings, the sutras, were memorized by monks. As the canon expanded, writing became essential. Texts were inscribed on palm leaves, tied with thread and wrapped in cloth or silk. Monasteries evolved into hubs of learning. Nalanda, a renowned monastic university founded in the 5th century CE, housed thousands of monks studying and copying texts on philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and language. Its library, said to contain hundreds of thousands of volumes, was divided into 3 buildings: Ratnasagara, Ocean of Jewels; Ratnodadi, Sea of Jewels; and Ratnarangaka, Delight of Jewels, each holding increasingly rare texts. When the library was destroyed by invading forces in the 12th century, it reportedly burned for months. The loss wasn't just material, it was the erasure of generations of scholarship and insight. In Tibet, Buddhist libraries carried an even deeper spiritual significance. Texts were carved onto wooden printing blocks or hand-copied onto scrolls. Rooms were filled with the Kangyur, the Buddha's words, and Tengyur, commentaries, wrapped in cloth and stored in custom-built wall shelves. Each manuscript was treated as a relic. Copying one was considered an act of devotion. In China and Japan, Buddhist libraries incorporated local innovations. China's invention of woodblock printing enabled mass production of sutras. Japan's Ishiyamadera Temple became a major archive for storing sacred scrolls. Monks sometimes buried scriptures in stone containers, known as sutra mounds, to protect them from war or decay, believing the teachings would In the Buddhist tradition, libraries were expressions of compassion. Preserving a text meant preserving the Dharma. Shelves were altars, ink was prayer. These libraries may have been quiet, but their impact stretched across continents, spreading peace, logic, and spiritual insight, one manuscript at a time. When we think of ancient libraries, we often imagine scrolls, marble buildings, and temples of knowledge. But across the ocean, many remarkable archives were destroyed before they could be fully understood. What we lost in the libraries of the Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations wasn't just written text, it was an entire world view. The Maya were among the most literate cultures of pre-Columbian America, with a complex writing system made of glyphs combining images and syllables. Their codices, books made from bark paper coated in lime, contained astronomical data, rituals, historical records and cosmology. Painted in vivid colors, these documents were stored in temple vaults and royal archives. At their peak, the Maya likely had hundreds, perhaps thousands of codices, but after the Spanish arrived, missionaries labeled these texts as heretical. Most were burned. One of the most notorious cases was that of Bishop Diego de Landa, who, in 1562, ordered the destruction of vast numbers of Maya books. He later wrote, "We found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contain nothing but superstitions and lies of the devil, we burned them all." Today, only 4 original Maya codices survive. The Aztecs also maintained large archives. Their books, called amoxcali, were made of deer hide, agave fibers, or bark paper. These texts recorded calendars, tribute payments, history, and mythology. Painted by skilled scribes known as tlaquilos, these works blended sacred and administrative knowledge. The libraries housing them were typically located in royal or temple complexes. The Inca Empire, lacking a formal writing system, relied on quipu, bundles of knotted strings used to track census data, taxes, and possibly narratives. These were managed by trained officials called quipucamayuk and kept in state archives. But as European colonizers advanced, these systems were eradicated. Libraries were burned or buried, and entire intellectual traditions were suppressed within a single generation. Unlike Alexandria or Nineveh, there are no dramatic accounts of great fires, just systematic colonial policies and missionary efforts that silenced centuries of indigenous knowledge. The libraries of the Americas didn't simply disappear, they were actively erased. And the silence left behind still echoes. The story of ancient libraries isn't just about preservation, it's about loss. Ashurbanipal's clay tablets endured only because fire baked them into permanence. Alexandria's scrolls vanished in flames. The Maya codices were burned by fearful hands. Nalanda's texts turned to ash under siege. Again and again, time, conquest, and neglect worked together to erase what once seemed permanent. It's estimated that over 90% of ancient literature has been lost. Entire genres have vanished. Greek comedies, Roman engineering manuals, Indian, medical texts, and American historical records. We often know the titles of these works, but not their content. Their absence leaves a void we can still feel. Why did so much disappear? Partly because of materials. Clay breaks, papyrus rots, bamboo, molds, and parchment burns. Books were once fragile and unique, susceptible even to a leaky roof. But war was worse. Invaders didn't just destroy books, they destroyed identity. In the ancient world, burning a people's library was as strategic as defeating their armies. The other reason is political. Knowledge is power, and power decides what is remembered. When regimes changed, so did the libraries. New rulers purged old ideas, scrolls were burned, competing authors erased. Whole schools of thought were lost for no longer fitting the dominant narrative, and yet some remnants survive. Clay shards pulled from ruins, charred scrolls unrolled by modern tools, lost books quoted in surviving ones. A Roman historian referencing a forgotten Greek poet, a Buddhist monk's copy of a manuscript that outlived its original, a Maya glyph scratched into stone that no missionary ever noticed. These fragments connect us to the ancient mind. They remind us that knowledge is never fully secure, but also never completely lost. Libraries may burn, but ideas migrate. They live on through translation, memory, and reinvention. Today's digital archives, cloud backups, and international databases are humanity's latest effort to resist that long history of loss. but the lesson remains. Preservation isn't a one-time task. It's a continuing responsibility. Every time we open a book, whether ancient or new, we help ensure that memory, once nearly extinguished, keeps burning. Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island, lies deep in the South Pacific, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. Wind-swept and remote, the island is just 63 square miles, yet it's home to one of the greatest puzzles of ancient engineering, the Moai statues. Nearly 1,000 of these massive stone figures dot the landscape, stern faces with long noses, heavy brows, and pursed lips. Most face inland, backs to the sea, as though watching over the land. Some are buried up to their necks, others lie unfinished in quarries. They provoke awe and countless questions. Who carved them? How were they moved? Why did their creators stop? To outsiders, Easter Island seemed like a riddle carved in volcanic stone. But for the Rapa Nui people, there is no mystery. It is their home. The Moai are not relics of a lost civilization. They are their ancestors. Though the first written account came from Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, Rapa Nui's story began centuries earlier when Polynesian navigators arrived using stars and ocean swells. They called the island Rapa Nui, Great Rapa, and built a society rooted in clan loyalty, spiritual belief, and deep reverence for the connection between the living and the dead. The Moai were carved not for vanity, but for memory, not as idols to be worshipped, but as living vessels of ancestral mana, spiritual energy. Each statue represented a deified chief or revered ancestor, standing guard over their descendants. These were not simply works of art, they were guardians, bridges between the heavens and the land. But time, like the sea, is unforgiving. By the time European sails appeared on the horizon, the island's society had shifted. The statues had been toppled, the forests vanished, and what remained was a faint echo of a once great civilization. Rapa Nui had become a question etched in stone, its meaning not erased, but buried beneath centuries of silence. Long before the Moai stood sentinel over the island's ridges, the land was untouched, lush, forested, and alive only with the cries of seabirds echoing across volcanic slopes. Then, sometime between 800 and 1200 CE, a fleet of Polynesian canoes arrived. These expert navigators crossed thousands of miles using only the stars, wave patterns, and bird movements to guide them. They came from the Marquesas or Mangareva, bringing more than just people. They carried pigs, chickens, taro, bananas, and sweet potatoes, everything needed to build a new life. Landing on Rapa Nui meant reaching the edge of the known world, one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth. Yet these settlers brought with them an entire culture, elaborate social systems, rich oral traditions, profound spirituality, and a legacy of monumental stonework. Over time, the island divided into clans, each overseeing distinct territories, anchored by a sacred ancestral figure, an idea soon to be immortalized in stone. The early Rapa Nui people flourished. Archaeological records reveal villages, crop cultivation using stone garden, beds to retain moisture, and chickens kept in stone pens. Their society was well organized and led by ariki, or chiefs, who held both political and spiritual power. Life revolved around honoring ancestors believed to influence everything from weather to harvests. This deep ancestral veneration would eventually take its most iconic form, the carving of the Moai. It's important to clarify that Rapa Nui was never a primitive or lost culture. It was a complex society, well adapted to its challenging environment, built on a seamless bond between the living and the dead. These settlers didn't just bring tools, they brought meaning. And it was that meaning that gave rise to giants, carved from stone. For now, in those early centuries, the island remained in harmony. Forests still covered the land. The sea was generous, the soil fertile. The first Moai was still generations away. But the cultural and spiritual groundwork had been laid for what would become one of the world's most striking sculptural legacies. The story was only beginning. At the center of Rapa Nui's sacred geography lies Rano Raraku, a volcanic crater with steep, carvable slopes. It was here that most of the Moai were born, not through myth, but through painstaking artistry. The volcanic tuff, a compressed ash stone, was soft enough for carving, at least initially. With time and exposure, the statues hardened into their iconic weathered forms, but Rano Raraku was more than a quarry. It was a sacred workshop, a site of pilgrimage, of sweat and devotion. From its cliffs and hillsides, Rapa Nui carvers sculpted hundreds of Moai. Some remain half-finished, others complete but never transported. Today, nearly 400 statues remain at the site, frozen mid-creation, as if the artisans simply vanished. Carving a Moai was no casual task. Each was commissioned by a clan to honor a specific ancestor, typically a powerful chief. The designs followed a symbolic template: elongated faces, heavy brows, long ears, and prominent noses. Bodies were often abstracted, with arms carved close to the torso and fingers rendered in narrow relief. Moai ranged from 6-foot figures to the massive El Gigante, an unfinished giant over 70 feet tall and weighing an estimated 150 tons. Artisans used handheld tools made from basalt, a denser volcanic rock, chipped into chisels and axes. The carving could take months, even years, and was a skill passed through generations. As the work progressed, the statues remained attached to the rock face. Only once nearly complete were they separated, moved downhill, and prepared for their final journey. What makes Rano Raraku haunting today is how many statues remain embedded in the ground. Many appear half-buried, but they are in fact full-bodied figures, their lower halves engulfed by centuries of soil erosion. The result is an eerie illusion, as if the Moai are sinking, when they've simply stood, unmoved, neck-deep in time. This crater was the birthplace of the island's giants. Here, stone met spirit, where human hands shaped volcanic ash into eternal ancestors. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Moai isn't how they were carved, but where they look. Nearly every Moai faces inland, away from the sea. This wasn't by accident. These statues weren't built to gaze at the ocean. They were built to watch the people. Each statue stood on a platform called an ahu, a ceremonial foundation that often served as a burial site for the individual represented. These platforms dotted the island's perimeter like spiritual boundary markers, anchoring clan territory and always looking inward, toward the community. To the Rapa Nui, the Moai were more than stone effigies. They were active presences, containers of mana, the sacred energy believed to reside in gods, chiefs, and honored ancestors. Once raised, a Moai was thought to channel mana into the land, ensuring prosperity and protection for the clan. They weren't memorials. They were participants, mediators between the spiritual and physical worlds. Their exaggerated features were deliberate, conveying idealized traits of wisdom, strength, and divine lineage. Deep-set eyes, pronounced noses, and long ears symbolized elite status and enduring vigilance. Some Moai were adorned with large red topknots called pukao, carved from a separate quarry at Punapau. These additions likely represented elite hairstyles or ceremonial headdresses. Originally, the statues also had coral-inlaid eyes with obsidian, or redstone pupils, giving them a piercing, lifelike gaze. When these eyes were added during ceremonies, it was said the Moai could finally see, transforming from mere stone to sacred presence. The inward gaze of the Moai reflects the essence of Rapa Nui spirituality. These figures weren't built for display. They were built for the people, facing their descendants, silently observing generation after generation pass, unwavering and eternal. So how do you move a 30-foot, 80-ton statue across uneven land without wheels, cranes, or metal tools? For centuries, this was Rapa Nui's great mystery. The moai are scattered far from the quarry at Rano Raraku, with many placed on stone ahu miles away. Early theories involved dragging them on sleds or rolling them on logs, ideas complicated by evidence of widespread deforestation. More speculative theories involved aliens or mystical levitation. But a more grounded answer may lie in Rapa Nui's own oral tradition, which claimed the moai walked. At first, this sounded metaphorical, but in 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo put the idea to the test. Using ropes and a team on each side of a moai replica, they rocked the statue upright, shifting it forward, much like moving a refrigerator. It worked. With coordination, balance, and rhythm, the statue could walk. No dragging, no science fiction. Just physics, teamwork, and cultural memory. The base of many moai even supports this theory. Flat at the back, rounded at the front, designed to tilt forward rather than lie down. This method would have required rope made from plant fibers, large cooperative teams, and above all, belief. In Rapa Nui cosmology, the statues moved not just through human effort, but through mana, the spiritual force commanded by priests and chiefs. So while science sees mechanics, the Rapa Nui saw divinity, and in a way both are correct. Moving the moai wasn't merely engineering. It was ritual, a collective expression of faith, ancestral connection, and social unity. The moai didn't move by magic. They moved because the people believed they must. And that belief, the cultural cohesion and spiritual resolve, was Rapa Nui's true marvel. As centuries passed, the pace of moai building didn't slow, it accelerated. What began as a spiritual practice evolved into inter-clan competition. Each group aimed to outshine the others with larger, more intricate statues. Rather than warfare, clans competed through artistry. Bigger moai meant more mana, more status, and a stronger ancestral claim. Rivalries intensified as groups aimed for higher platforms, newer designs, and bolder symbolism. The arms race wasn't about violence, it was about spiritual prestige. This drive led to innovations. The addition of pukao, massive red stone topknots, added both visual and symbolic height. Some weighed up to 12 tons, and likely represented elite hairstyles or ceremonial garb. Moai design also evolved. Early statues were relatively modest over time. The moai grew slimmer, more angular, and dramatically taller. Some of the later statues stood over 30 feet high, towering figures watching over villages like ancestral titans. But this growth had a cost. To sustain the expanding statue-building effort, the island's forests were cut down. Timber was likely used for growing food, cooking fires, canoe-making, and, according to earlier theories, moving the statues themselves. As the trees disappeared, the soil eroded, harvests declined, and fresh water became harder to control. The very resources that had sustained the moai culture were being used up. Yet the islanders didn't stop. They carved even more statues, larger ones, digging deeper into spiritual practices, hoping their ancestors would restore harmony. But balance was already slipping away. As the island's environment degraded, tensions rose between clans. What had once been collaboration turned into rivalry and resentment. The unity that helped move mountains was breaking down under the pressure of survival. The golden age of moai carving had become a heavy burden, but stopping wasn't an option. The moai were more than art. They were the soul of Rapa Nui culture, so the people kept carving, pulling meaning from stone, even as the ground beneath them gave way. A spiritual arms race had begun, and no one could afford to lose. By the 1600s, the unthinkable happened. Rapa Nui began to fall apart. The very system that had once brought unity, ancestor worship through moai construction, was pushing the island to collapse. The forests were gone. Without trees, there were no canoes for fishing, no fuel for cooking or warmth, and no shelter from the wind and sun. The once rich volcanic soil, once shaded and anchored by roots, had eroded. Crops failed. Fresh water became scarce. And yet, the carving continued. The statues grew larger, more elaborate, and demanded more labor. The spiritual engine that powered the island had no brakes. Eventually, the people made a drastic decision. They stopped raising the moai. Some statues were abandoned mid-transport, left lying on ancient roads like forgotten giants. Others were never finished, left in the quarry with chisels frozen in time. The spiritual arms race had reached its breaking point. The ancestors could no longer give what nature couldn't support. Then came the topplings. Archaeological evidence shows that by the late 1600s, moai across the island were deliberately pushed over. Their necks snapped, their faces broken. This wasn't erosion, it was the result of conflict. Clans clashed over land, water, and status. The very statues that once symbolized unity became symbols of anger and revenge. Oral history calls this time the rise of the Huri Moai, the era of statue toppling. As faith in the moai system crumbled, power shifted to a new spiritual and political order, the Birdman cult. This new tradition valued agility, competition, and ritual conflict over ancestral lineage. It was the end of an era. By the time Europeans first landed in 1722, Rapa Nui society had already changed dramatically. None of the statues stood upright. The spiritual foundation of the culture had broken, and the people were left struggling to survive on a stripped, divided island. Rapa Nui's collapse wasn't a single catastrophe. It was a slow decline, driven by environmental depletion, social division, and a belief system that couldn't adapt fast enough. What remained were shattered stone ancestors, gazing skyward as if wondering what had gone wrong. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, he encountered a society already in decline. The moai were toppled. The forests were gone. The people were few, thin, and visibly worn down by generations of hardship. Roggeveen and his crew took note of the statues and the barren landscape, but didn't understand the culture that had once built them. Then the outsiders kept coming. Over the next 2 centuries, European contact brought devastating consequences. Whalers, missionaries, traders, and slavers each left their mark. Most erased more than they recorded. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders captured nearly 1,500 Rapa Nui people, including chiefs and scribes. Few returned. Those who did brought smallpox, which tore through the remaining population. Worse still were the Christian missionaries who arrived soon after. They banned traditional rituals, destroyed sacred artifacts, and forced religious conversions, replacing the moai-based spiritual system with imported European beliefs. Oral histories were suppressed. A unique written script, Rongorongo, possibly the only indigenous script in Oceania, was nearly lost. By the late 1800s, the island's population had dropped to just over 100. Colonial authorities divided up Rapa Nui land, leasing it for sheep grazing and fencing off sacred sites. The Rapa Nui people were confined to a small part of their own island, with limited access to the moai. Once powerful family symbols, the statues became neglected, looted, or treated as exotic relics by foreign collectors. European archaeologists took statues, ceremonial objects, even human remains, shipping them off to museums in London, Paris, and Santiago. Some moai were severed at their base and transported whole, now displayed thousands of miles from their ancestral homes. The island became a symbol of cultural erasure. Yet the Rapa Nui people never forgot who they were. Even in forced silence, They carried the memory of the Moai. Their traditions survived, hidden, whispered, passed down in fragments. And slowly, over time, they began reclaiming the stories carved in stone. But first, the world had to listen. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Rapa Nui began a slow and determined journey of cultural recovery. The Moai, long fallen and buried by time, conflict and neglect, were raised once again, not just as relics but as emblems of resilience. In the 1950s, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl brought international attention to Easter Island. His theories, many now outdated, including ideas of South American influence, sparked global archaeological interest. This time, researchers came not to take, but to study and preserve. Restoration began in earnest. Fallen Moai were returned to their Ahu platforms. Coral eyes were restored, pukao topknots were replaced, ancient roads, quarries and ceremonial spaces were carefully mapped and studied. A clearer view of Rapa Nui culture emerged, one not of mystery, but of technical skill, spiritual richness and cultural depth. But the most important voices were no longer foreign. They were Rapa Nui voices, descendants of the original builders, began reclaiming their language, ceremonies and land rights. In 2017, Chile formally transferred control of Rapa Nui National Park, including most of the island's heritage sites, back to the Rapa Nui people. Today, locals care for the Moai. Decisions about excavation and conservation are made with cultural insight and ancestral respect. New generations are learning their history, not just from books, but from elders, chants, dances, and the Moai themselves. Efforts to decode Rongorongo continue, and global pressure is growing for institutions like the British Museum and the Louvre to return Moai and sacred objects taken during colonization. Now, Rapa Nui stands at a crossroads between memory and modern life. Tourism brings both opportunity and challenges. But the Rapa Nui people protect their culture, not as a museum piece, but as a living legacy. The Moai are no longer silent guardians of a forgotten world. They are witnesses to endurance, to a culture that survived collapse, colonization, and erasure, and still found a way to rise. Cracked stone, burned forests, silenced voices, but the ancestors still stand.